We are talking about when is the best time to start writing your first R01 if you are a K Award recipient. So, if you're new around here, I'm Sarah Dobson. I am a research grant consultant, and my team and I work with early career researchers who are applying to NIH. And one of the programs that we offer is a K to R transition program for women faculty. And that's the context in which I hear this question. We've got these women faculty who are partway through their K award. They're thinking about, when's the right time for me to actually get started on writing my first R01. So I know that this can be a really kind of stressful and mysterious point in your career and a stressful and mysterious process. And there are tons of questions about how to do it well, right? How to successfully transition from your career development award to R-level funding. So let's talk about that. I know there's a lot of competing advice from mentors and colleagues that can make the process feel even more overwhelming. So part of what we're going to do in this session is just kind of get a lay of the land. Like, what do you need to think about as you are considering making that transition from your career development award to R-level funding? So the first thing to say is that I always have a little bit of trouble answering this question directly because it's not a simple answer, right? The reason that it's not a simple answer is because there is a lot more to getting an R01 funded than just doing the writing, getting started on the writing, right? So yes, of course, there's an actual writing process, and I do have some ways for you to think about sort of project managing your grant application. But before we even get there, there are a whole series of questions that you need to answer that might not seem like they have anything to do with writing your first R01. So for example, where do you want to make an impact with your research? What big, juicy, scientific, clinical, or population level problem do you want to focus on to lend your skills and abilities and expertise, right? What's your 5-year goal? What projects are you currently working on that aren't aligned with where you're headed with your research? And what do you plan to do about that? What daily and weekly habits do you have in place that are going to support your grant and paper writing pipeline? Where are your boundaries with other people maybe a bit too permeable? And what can you do to reinforce them? And where do you need to enforce boundaries with yourself? So that's just a taste of what you need to think about before you ever put pen to paper or keyboard to blinking cursor, right? So why do you need to think about those things first? It's because if you want a successful and prolific research career doing the research that matters to you, you can't do everything you want to do and everything that other people want you to do. So I'm going to bet if you're anything like the women I coach, part of what got you to where you are today is by being a good student and checking all those boxes and saying yes to every request. That has served you up to this point. But I'm also going to bet that you feel run down and overwhelmed and pulled in a million different directions. And that's because you've said yes to everything and you've ended up on a dozen committees and possibly even committed to being co-I on a project or two because you were anticipating that you might not be able to actually fund the projects you care about. So you might be working on your own research on nights and weekends or just generally off the side of your desk, right? But if you want to do the research you really care about and make the kind of impact that you want to make in your career, you're going to need to establish some clear priorities. You're going to have to disappoint some people. And the clearer you are about what you're here to accomplish, the impact you want to make with your research, the easier it's going to be for you to make those decisions. So you really do have to have focus and clarity about what you want to work on and where you want to make your impact. And often that involves making some really hard decisions. And the very first thing you need to do before you ever start writing your R01 is to get more clear and courageous about how you spend your time. And you will always feel overextended until you figure this part out. Because if you're not clear where you're headed, you're probably going to either say yes to opportunities that come your way without having a framework to decide whether this is a good decision or not, or you'll avoid making decisions so that they're essentially made for you, right? And we definitely don't want that. So building up that trust in yourself and that sense of direction, that sense of clarity in what you want to focus on, that is the very first step to building your roadmap to your first R01. Because once you have that sense of direction, it's so much easier to block out the noise and the distractions and to make sure that you're laser focused on what needs to happen to get your research funded. So the next thing you need to have in place before you even start writing your R01 is an actual success strategy. So what are all the elements you need to have in place to make your R01 as competitive as possible? And to do this, you need to think conceptually about your project. So who needs to be on the team? What sort of publications do you need to have to present yourself as a strong PI? And does your research idea align with the mission and priorities of your target funding institute? Those are all strategic questions that you need to ask, but that can be done at the conceptual level, right? So if you don't have a success strategy in place, your grant will come off as disorganized and uninteresting. So it's really important to think about what will make it most appealing to your target audiences. Only then are you ready to actually start writing. So in practical terms, I recommend starting this process, this sort of big picture vision, and then the success strategy about midway through your K award, because by then you'll have made some progress on your research and you'll still have plenty of time to write a strong application, get excellent feedback from the peer review process, and resubmit your application during your K award process. But because you're midway through and you have some of that research under your belt, you'll also have a much clearer idea of kind of where this is going and where you want to go. So that seems to be sort of the sweet spot for getting started, to give yourself enough time and avoid some of that extra pressure and panic, but to also feel like you're far enough along that you're ready for that next stage, right? But I want to highlight another red flag that I see a lot at this stage too, that we're going to be talking about more in depth in future live sessions. But here is just a taste. And that is getting too caught up on submitting for a specific deadline. So you might be wondering why this is a bad thing, especially when I'm always droning on about making sure that you are planning ahead and being organized and, doing things well in advance. And all of that is still true. So I'm going to give you an illustrative example, okay? This example is not about one specific person, but sort of an amalgamation of a lot of conversations that I've had over the last kind of 18 months or so with faculty who are interested in joining this K to R transition program. So it's September right now, and let's use that as the example timeline. So for example, let's say somebody has reached out to say that they're planning to submit for the February deadline, which is a few months away. And when we dig a little deeper, it turns out that one of their main areas of concern is that they're not really sure where they're headed conceptually when it comes to their overall program of research, or even specifically their upcoming R01. But when I ask, what they plan to do to solidify their concept, they say, well, I want to work with you on doing that. To which I say, great, that's great. But there's no way that you're going to be able to do what you need to do to solidify your concept, make sure you have the supporting evidence you need, create your success strategy, get feedback that's required to write a competitive R01, do all of that before the February deadline. There's no way that you can do that in such a short period of time, especially if you, like most of the women I work with, are already overcommitted, overstretched, overextended, right? So my next question is, would you consider aiming for the June deadline? And they say, oh, no, I really need to get this grant in by February. And when I ask why, it's usually because their ESI status is running out, or they're extra stressed about falling off the K cliff. And they just want to make sure that they submit something that sort of qualifies or gets the ball rolling, or even it's just that they decided that this is the deadline that they're focused on and that's the one. So here's another example of short-term versus long-term thinking, right? You're making a short-term decision that will end up hurting you in the long term, because what happens when you put in an R01 that you haven't really thought through? It gets triaged, and your ESI status doesn't actually help all that much at all, right? So yes, it is important to plan and set deadlines, but make sure that you're thinking about that bigger picture. Do you have a strong foundation in place that's going to allow you to successfully meet that deadline? Or are you operating on a wish and a prayer? Okay, so let's recap. If you are a K Award recipient, when is the best time to start writing your first R1? So first we talked about the difference between the actual mechanics of writing the grant and all the things you need to do well in advance of the writing to make sure that you're set up for success. That includes things that seem totally unrelated to grant writing, like your habits and boundaries and schedule, your 5-year plan, your goal for your career, those kinds of things. It's important to have that foundation in place well before you start actually writing your R01 so that you're creating a sustainable system for writing grants, not just this one time, but for the rest of your career. Since we know that you're going to be writing these grants until you retire, it's in your best interest to have that system in place that allows you to thrive rather than going through that write, burnout, recover cycle that so many academics do. And trust me, once you get on that right burnout recover cycle, it's really hard to remove yourself. So setting yourself up for success properly the first time is going to serve you for the rest of your career. In practical terms, it's wise to start this process towards the midpoint of your K award because you have enough of it behind you that you're able to make some well-informed assessments about your research productivity and your direction. And you also have lots of time to get comfortable with the R1 writing process and to expect to resubmit at least once. That's something else that we'll talk about in future live sessions, just this idea about the amount of pressure that you put on yourself by expecting to get your R1 funded on the first shot. That is not what you should be aiming for at all. You should be aiming to get really good feedback and use that feedback to resubmit and get a great score the next time. We'll talk about that a little more in another live session, but that's just another little preview for you. Finally, we talked about the dangers of being too fixated on a specific deadline, especially if you don't have those foundational components in place that will allow you to thrive. So remember that usually the reason that you're focused on a specific deadline is that you think it's going to give you some kind of advantage in the funding process. But if you're throwing something together, if it's poorly thought through, if it's disorganized, you're not going to gain any kind of advantage, no matter what your deadline is, or no matter what the advantage actually is, right? So if you found this helpful and you'd like some support as you get ready to level up from your K Award funding to your first R1, please join the waitlist for the next round of the Impact Incubator, which is our K to R transition program for women faculty. There's a link to the waitlist in the video description. So if you're on the waitlist, you will get access to an exclusive class that I'm teaching on September 22nd called Roadmap to Your R01, the 3 must-haves of a successful NIH applicant. The class is only available to people on the waitlist, so make sure you sign up. All right, I will see you next time.